So welcome to our 38th Physics Maths Colloquium. So this live event is organized by the Forum on International Physics, the FIP, which is a voluntary association of the American Physical Society members who are inspired in advancing knowledge of physics and its diffusion. So hence, this live open access is a virtual scientific expedition fostering the cooperation and transcending the frontier of knowledge for and by developing community. So, and it's originally inspired by the Sesame Light Source in Jordan. So you can visit all our previous recording where renowned speakers have been presenting tools for discovery and scientific case on basic science, mainly light source and neutron source. So in particular, I would like to point out that last May 2023 and November 2022, those two editions, where the FIP has gathered forces with the IUPAP, so the International Union of Pure and Applied Physics, sharing the importance on a common mission for sustainable development and celebrating the IUPAP 100 years of existence with a renovated vision. So, and a matter of fact, tomorrow, under the direction of this IOPAP, the new inaugurated Science Gateway will host the UNESCO closing of the International Year of Basic Science and Sustainable Development. But today, we will tackle another sustainable episode. So sharing the complexity of all the different interactions of the physics, environmental, and development issue. So that's a complex aspect that Professor George Ellis will give us. So together with Professor Ellis, today, we will have also Andrea Lossi, who is the director of the Sesame. And I will, for my case, for the FIP, represent the share of the physics of international science. And we will have this introduction, which will come after the possibility for us to ask the different questions to Professor Ellis. But let's introduce our prestigious guest today, George Ellis. He is a professor emeritus of applied mathematics at the University of Cape Town. He obtained his PhD at the University of Cambridge, where he worked on general relativity theory and cosmology. He has been based at the University of Cape Town since 1974. And he has been visiting professor of Texas, Chicago, Hamburg, in Boston, in Edmonton, in London, Oxford, and for a while he was professor of cosmic physics at the International School of Advanced Study, the CISA in Trieste, in Italy. So in the recent years, he has been working on the philosophy of cosmology and the emergence of the complexity, the nature of causality, causation, and the aspect of the neuroscience. So his book includes the large-scale structure of space-time, written with Stephen Hawking. So the moral nature of the universe, cosmology, theoretical theology, and ethics by Nancy and with Nancy Murphy. The downward causation of the neurobiology and the free will. So this is also with Mr. Murphy and Mr. O'Connell. And how can physics underlie the mind and beyond evolutionary psychology? To return with Mark Short. So after this short introduction, I will ask to write your question, and we will have possibility after this presentation to give some answer. And you can also raise your hand, and that way we'll have the possibility to get you live asking your question to Professor Ellis. So if you can now start your presentation, Professor Ellis.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm very honored to be asked to give this presentation. So I'm going to share the screen. Oh, there we go. Okay. Right.
Yes.
So I hope that that's clear. So I want to talk about the interaction of physics, environmental and developmental issues. And to do this, one must take complexity seriously. That's the concept of my talk. So I've got 6 sections. Our aim is making a real difference in the world. Some issues are essentially physics-based. Some relate to complexity, and complexity is based on hierarchies which exist everywhere. Causation is always contextual, the crises facing us, and taking action, values, evidence, and emotion. So those are the sections I'm going to talk about. So our aim is making real differences in the world, and the big picture is twofold. Firstly, physics is worth doing in its own right. It's a fascinating subject. You're understanding the underlying laws which make things work the way they do. And a big deal here is helping students to reach an international level in all physics areas. And I've done that in Cambridge, in Cape Town for many years. I was at ICTP in Trieste. And all students from around the world, doesn't matter where you come from, and in particular, of course, I'm very interested in Africa, are able to reach a high international level. And that's a very worthwhile thing to do. Physics is understanding physics in its own right. But secondly, using physical expertise to help improve life. And in which ways is this possible? Many years ago, just after Nelson Mandela became president of my country in the democratic transition, I wrote an overview of these issues, and in Google Scholar you can find an article, Science Research Policy in South Africa, which I wrote in 1994. It was a report to the Royal Society of South Africa at the time of the democratic transition in this country, suggesting what kinds of sciences were worth doing. And in terms of science for its own sake, there's a good questions you can ask. Is this a special time for doing science for its own sake? And if so, what science? And one could spend a lot of time on this, but I'm going to suggest a particular area which is very interesting at the present time is the study of the brain and artificial intelligence and the way that they interact with each other. And there's a lot of really, really interesting stuff going on in that area, which is fascinating intellectually, and it also has really practical implications because AI is becoming a global player in many different ways. Special time for global warming. We're approaching tipping points in the global scene, and if we don't do something about that very soon, global warming, this is a special time in terms of global warming, and understanding that and what can be done about it is a really important science. There's some science working which is worth doing because you're in a special place. And astronomy, geology, archaeology in my own country, South Africa, is very important for astronomy because for astronomy, you need the southern hemisphere as well as the north. And in the southern hemisphere, you need very good telescopes in South America, Australia, and Africa. And South Africa is a major player in astronomy. So a very good place for astronomy is South Africa. Geology, we've got wonderful geology in our country relating to the history of the continent. And archaeology, South Africa was the origin of mankind, and there's wonderful stuff going on there about the start of the life of humanity. So that's science for its own sake, making a real difference in the world. Is science meeting an urgent need? One of the ones which I'm really interested in is helping with hunger, helping with climate change, helping with cancer. Cancer is a very, very terrible scourge. And one of the big issues is to what degree can science help with meeting cancer? So I'm not going to pursue this further. I'm saying we can talk about developing science for its own sake and talk about making a real difference in the world. And looking at these issues, we have to deal with the interactions of physics, environmental issues, and economic developmental issues. Because if you're going to make a change, these are going to be what one deals with, but interaction with economics and developmental issues will come in, and that's really complicated. So these are very complicated interactions. So we must take the complexity of all of these issues seriously and investigate a bit the basis of how complex systems work. And this involves their hierarchical nature, which I will talk about. Now, some developmental issues are essentially physics-based. This is because physics underlies all that emergence. Physics underlies ecosystems, societies. Issues to do with energy usage, global warming, have direct relations to physics. And I'm going to point out this book, Vaclav Smil, How the World Really Works. It's a wonderful book. He gives numbers for everything. He takes a very evidence-based view, and he picks up a number of issues, which I will now talk about. So I'm really recommending to you this book, How the World Really Works, a scientist's guide to our past, present, and future. So one section he talks about is understanding energy. And he makes the point that energy conversions are the basis of life, evolution, and economic systems. All of life uses energy, transforms it from one form to another. Evolutionary processes due to economic systems are based in energy conversions. He talks about how large nuclear reactors are the most reliable producers of energy. Now, I'm not going to defend what he says, I'm just going to say what he says, and he gives figures to support us. He talks about the advantage of liquid fuels because they have a very high energy density and very good ease of production, ease of storage, and ease of distribution. So when you're understanding energy, liquid fuels are good in these terms. Lubricants are needed to minimize friction. This is very important. Without lubricants, you lose a lot of energy. And so lubrication is an essential part of dealing with energy properly. Electricity's use, it's effortless and clean. You just turn on a switch and there it is. You don't have any problems of transporting fuels around or coal around and so on. But the problem with electricity is storability. And for physicists, if any of you can come up with really new ways of storing electricity, new ideas for batteries of some kind, that is a really important thing which you could do. And that's an essentially physical problem. And of course, associated with energy is global warming concerns, which have led to widespread calls for doing away with fossil fuels as soon as possible. And that is one of the main reasons that modern nuclear reactors are needed, but it's not as easy to do that because fossil fuels play a really important part in today's modern industrial societies. So he talks about understanding food production, his next big theme. That theme was understanding energy. The next is understanding food production. And the point he makes is highly mechanized farming requires non-renewable anthropogenic energy. Anthropogenic means they influence nature. And these are derived overwhelmingly from coal. And so you have a fuel for tractors and so on. And you can't easily have an electric tractor. And if you do have an electric tractor, where would you get the electricity from? You would have to get electricity from somewhere else. Farm machines of many kinds consume fossil fuels, diesel or gasoline directly. And that's one of the major users of fossil fuels. So underlying food production is farm machines that use these fossil fuels. The energies used for these purposes are dwarfed by the energy requirements of producing agrochemicals. Fertilizers use large quantities of potassium, phosphate, and ammonia, and to get hold of the potassium, phosphate, and ammonia requires a lot of energy. So these are one of the main ways which energy is used in food production. And of course, we want to overcome hunger, and we've had great agricultural revolutions based on mechanized farming, farm machines, and agrochemicals. Smil does a very interesting comparison. He contrasts bread, chickens, and tomatoes, and he shows how they have very different energy requirements. With chicken, the most efficient, and tomatoes with the highest energy cost of these three. But he says capturing seafood is the most energy-intensive process of food provision because of the diesel oil used in capturing seafood. And as a physicist, these are the kind of energy calculations you can do, and you can make recommendations about what kind of farming is good in terms of environmental impact. He talks about understanding our material world, and he proposes the 4 pillars of modern civilization. Firstly, ammonia. He calls it the gas that feeds half the world because it provides as fertilizer for agriculture via the Haber-Bosch process. And of course, that process takes a lot of energy. So ammonia is the gas that feeds the world because it provides fertilizer, which we need. He talks about the second very important thing in material terms is plastics. They're very, very diverse. There are many, many different kinds of plastic. They're very, very useful, but they cause very troublesome pollutions. There's a huge problem with plastic bags and the pollution caused by plastic bags getting into the sea, animals getting trapped in plastic of all kinds. There are celluloids, polyethylene, polypropylene, polyvinyl chloride, PVC, and so on. All of these are incredibly useful in modern societies. And particularly, they can be formed very, very flexibly into almost any shape we want by casting, pressing, or extruding, all physical processes. Critical to healthcare are PVCs because they are used a lot in emergency wards, in handling, in keeping things clean, and also personal protective equipment, which is very important, is also based in plastics. The third thing he talks about is the very important for modern civilization is steel, which is ubiquitous, it's everywhere, and he says it's recyclable. You can recycle steel, although again, that's at an energy cost. And it's used in mass transport, in trains, cars and so on. It's used in the home, all sorts of appliances, automobiles, reinforced concrete, a major use of steel, bridges, machine tools, weapons, and so on. And the fourth very important pillar of modern civilization is concrete. And he talks about a world created by cement. All the buildings around us have got concrete, and they're reinforced concrete, so they've also got steel. Transportation infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and so on use a lot of concrete. Airport runways, dams, and so on. So these are the 4 material things that underlie our modern civilization. And we wouldn't have a civilization as we know it if we didn't have these 4 things. And then finally, he talks about understanding the environment. And oxygen is crucial to life. It's the most vital element of life. If you're starved of oxygen for only a few minutes, you die, but oxygen is not in danger. It's not one of the things we have to worry about, but water is crucial. And a good quality water that's going to keep us healthy is crucial. And it's almost universally mismanaged resource. It's all very well having water, but then a huge amount gets lost in municipal supplies. It goes into the pipes. Pipes are old, they leak, and so on. So managing water is a crucial part of managing civilization and the environment. Food production, I've talked about, is taking about 1/3 of non-glaciated land which isn't covered by glaciers. About 1/3 of that is being used for food. It uses much fertilizer and energy. The main problem with plant nutrients is their unwanted presence in water. So you fertilize the food, but then it goes into streams, into lakes, and so on, and then poisons those very important resources. Now, the greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse effect is what leads to global warming. If the greenhouse effect is not just bad, it keeps the Earth from being permanently frozen. If the greenhouse effect didn't keep heat trapped on Earth to a considerable degree, then the temperature of the Earth would be too low for life to be possible, because the whole Earth would be permanently frozen. Now, global warming is due to anthropogenic, that's human-driven, emission of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. This puts at risk global water supplies, but not necessarily global food supplies, and he talks about this in detail. But global warming is accompanied, as I'm sure you're aware, by massive floods and fires. And these have been on the increase greatly around the world in recent years. Global warming is a truly global phenomenon. It's not the result of any specific nation. It's a result of what happened by all nations, the way they're behaving. And its largest anthropogenic cause caused by humans is the combustion of fuels that I've talked about that constitute the energetic foundations of civilization. So you've got a problem. Those fuels are needed to power civilization, but they cause global warming. Now, it's a physics and environmental issue. How do we balance this equation? And you've got to look into the physics of this. Solar incoming radiation comes down. Some is reflected by clouds and aerosols, goes back out. Some goes down to the surface and goes back out. Some is absorbed by the surface. Some is absorbed by the atmosphere. Some is emitted by the atmosphere. Some is re-emitted by the earth. It goes back, and then some comes back down through greenhouse gases, so you get the cycle. You've got evapotranspiration, and you've got thermals going up, goes to up there, and it goes to the sky, to the night sky. And so this is the physics underlying this, and there's all of these different effects taking place. It's a very complicated set of interactions taking place, and physicists can understand this and study this and see how these are all interacting with each other. And the greenhouse gases are where we are making a great big difference to what goes on. The greenhouse effect, all of this is powered by nuclear fusion in the sun, because the incoming solar radiation, the sun, is nothing but a great big thermal reactor, converting hydrogen to helium and so on up to heavier elements. So we've got a great big nuclear reactor in the sky, creating all of this radiation, and then it's reflected back out. And this greenhouse effect is necessary for life, as I've said, because otherwise the Earth would be too cold. But the greenhouse effect mustn't be too strong, because then the temperature rises too high. And one of the key things in here, this radiation goes to the night sky, which acts as a heat sink. From a thermodynamic viewpoint, there's a thermodynamic engine, heat coming in at high temperature, going out at infrared radiation. And so it's a heat engine with the dark night sky acting as a heat sink, which is a link to cosmology, which we could talk about. So now, some issues related to complexity, and complexity arises from hierarchies everywhere. And the basic principle of complexity is take a complex task, break it up into simpler tasks, create modules to handle the simpler tasks, repeat until you go down to even simpler tasks, modules to handle the simpler tasks, and keep going down until a level is reached where the task can be solved. Combine the outcomes to produce a solution to the complex task, chain up, and then you get a solution to the initial complex task you wanted to solve by this process of breaking it up into simpler task modules, going down, putting them together, going back up. And crucially important in this is hide the internal workings of the modules from the external world. So when you've had a modular hierarchical structure, the external world doesn't know the details of how the models are going. It just needs to know that the module is doing what it's supposed to do. So this is the modular structure of life. Atoms, there, molecules, cells. Cells are the first level, biological cells, where all the functions of life exist. Those make up tissues, those make up organs, body systems, and organisms, such as you, me, and elephants, which is where agency occurs. These make populations, which enables individuals to exist. Organisms depend on populations. Populations are made up of organisms. These make up communities. These make up ecosystems, and the ecosystems enable populations to exist. So this is a hierarchy. And one thing you must remember is the huge numbers. There's a huge number of cells making up each of us, 10 to the 13 cells in each person, 10 to the 11th atoms in each cell, molecules in each cell, and the numbers of cells and of atoms we are made up is enormous. And so this is a modular hierarchical structure. We can have two hierarchies, the natural sciences hierarchy and the biology one. So the naturals is one, some fundamental theory, particle physics, atomic, physical chemistry, material science, geology, space science, astronomy, cosmology. That's the natural sciences one. And then on the biology side, fundamental theory, particle physics, atomic, chemistry, biochemistry, cell biology, physiology, psychology, sociology, economics, and politics. These are the hierarchies on the natural sciences side and the biology side. Different emergent effective laws hold at each level. There are laws at each level, laws of geology, laws of physiology, laws of psychology, sociology, laws of atomic physics and particle physics. So they're effective laws at each emergent level. And all levels are needed for the whole to work. If you were to try to omit the level of cell biology, biology wouldn't work. If you tried to omit physiology, it wouldn't work. Every level is needed for the whole thing to work. Now, bottom-up causation, microforces determine what happens at the next level. High-level structures, new properties emerge from the lower level at each of those steps in the previous slide. New kinds of variables and law come into being at the high level. This goes between each level and so change from the bottom upwards to the top. And so you get in here, you get microphysics underlies macrophysics, such as the kinetic theory of gases. Physics underlies chemistry, the nature of the chemical bond. Physics and chemistry underlie the functioning of the brain through neuroscience. And that's the way that bottom-up causation takes place. But contextual effects occur when the higher levels causally affect what happens at lower levels in a coordinated way. And this happens between adjacent ways, and so change down. And so you, in addition to the upward stuff, you also get downward causation taking place. And this is absolutely fundamental to all complex causation. So you get downward causation taking place at L. So epigenetics determines what happens in cell biology. Cell processes initiate chemical cycles. Mind controls physiological events such as walking. If I decide I'm going to walk, I make a decision. Signals go all the way down to the particle physics level, and my mind sends signals down through neurons, down to muscles, and there that makes electrons move at this level. And so things change down every time you decide to move your hand. A thought at this level is causing events to take place at the level of particles, electrons moving in the muscles in your body. Now, a very interesting thing to look at is computers. The same kind of thing happens in computers. Here's a physical hierarchy for computers. Superstrings may be quarks, nucleons, atoms, transistors, resistors, capacitors, logic circuits and registers, arithmetic logic unit, primary memory, and the bus, the central processing unit, memory circuits, the motherboard, memory banks, the computer, the local network, the global network. That's a hierarchy for digital computers. But what determines what happens in a computer is software. And you've also got a software hierarchy. And here you've got the device level, where physical stuff, the digital logical level, the microarchitecture level, instruction set architecture level, operating system machine level, assembly language level, problem-oriented language level, and applications program. These are the levels of the software side. And here you have data, you have classes and objects, you have symbolic names, you have virtual memory, paging, machine language, microprograms, gates and registers, and transistors and connectors. And my main point here is downward causation takes place, because if you ask what happens, you load an applications program. It may be word processing, it may be an AI program, it may be a program for processing images, and you load data, and it's that program which changes down and determines what happens all the way down right to the device level. And what changes it down is compilers or interpreters that changes the logic down, and it controls what electrons flow through what devices at this level. So the way that causation works is downward. It's determined by the applications program you load on the one hand and the data, and that determines what happens at the lower levels. Now, in ecology, this is I took this out of a slide and it's the other way up. The organisms are at this level, the populations at this level. This is an inverted pyramid. Communities at this level, groups of populations, ecosystems at this level, communities and biotic factors, and the whole biosphere, which encompasses all the other levels from the deep soil up through the atmosphere. So this is the levels of organization and ecology. It's depicted the other way up. Small things are at the top and the big things at the bottom. And this only shows the higher levels. It doesn't show all of the stuff above there. Now, causation in all of these cases is always contextual. How does complexity such a life arise from physics? I've already emphasized both upward causation and downward causation takes place. Downward causation takes place in two ways, by setting boundary conditions and constraints. So for instance, if I connect electric wires from a battery to a bulb, light bulb, the electric wires channel the flow of electrons from the battery to the bulb, and this is a boundary, it's a constraint. It constrains where the electrons go from the battery, and it makes the light turn on. The other way downward causation takes place is by creating, modifying, and deleting lower level elements. So for instance, chemical processes create new molecules. Reading of genes creates proteins, and these are processes whereby you create new things at a lower level which didn't exist before. And I'm going to give you examples of both of these now. So the way in which boundary conditions cause stuff to take place, an example is nuclear synthesis of elements in a star, something which is now very well understood. This is a red giant star. You've got hydrogen and helium, you've got shells, helium and neon, helium, carbon, neon, oxygen, carbon, oxygen, neon, magnesium, silicon and sulfur, iron and nickel in the core. This is a red giant star, and shells of nuclear burning are taking place at the boundaries between these zones. And the kind of interaction that takes place is a nuclear reaction here that builds neutron-rich isotopes here, nitrogen going to fluorine, to oxygen, to neon by helium accretion. And the point about this is what happens at each radius is determined by the structure of the star. The structure of the star, gravity is holding it in. The nuclear energy is causing heat, which is creating pressure, which is pushing it out. And the gravity and the pressure are in equilibrium with each other. And it is the different temperatures at different levels which determine what nuclear reactions can take place. So this is contextual. What can take place at each level is determined by the temperature and pressure as a function of radius. That's downward causation from the structure of the star into the nuclear reactions which are taking place, and it's how carbon and iron come into being in the star. So the structure sets up the context in which different nuclear reactions take place at different levels, and that's an example of downward causation by this macrostructure, this huge macrostructure determining the details of the microreactions. Now, an example from physics as a completely different kind is superconductivity, which is a fascinating subject. And superconductivity takes place in very specific materials, which have a lattice structure. And the lattice, you've got positive nuclei there, and you've got electron moving between them. And what happens is very, very strange because you get Cooper pairs taking. You get two electrons moving together as one entity. And this, how on earth can it happen that a Cooper pair comes into being when electrons repel each other? And they repel each other, but the point is the following: lattice distortions taking place. That's a higher level thing. It's a bigger scale than electrons. The distortions act downwards to create the Cooper pairs. They create an area of higher positive charge, and it's that area of higher positive charge which keeps these two electrons together. And so the existence of the Cooper pairs, which leads to superconductivity, takes place because of the context of this lattice. And that lattice brings into being these Cooper pairs. So, and similarly, crystal structures lead to the existence of quasi-particles such as phonons that determine solid state material properties. So this is the way whereby downward causation takes place, by bringing into existence things which wouldn't exist otherwise. Now, biological functioning of an individual, upward and downward causal effects take place. We've got protons and electrons, genes, proteins, protein and RNA networks, cells, organs, and organisms. These trigger cell signaling. These control gene expression. The proteins and RNA selection read correct genes, and these control interactions at the level of protons and electrons. So in an organism, stuff that takes place at the organ level, for instance, you start running and you need more oxygen, that triggers cell signaling saying, hey, we need more oxygen. That goes down and triggers mechanisms in the body which will create more oxygen by setting up protein and RNA networks. Genes and proteins create proteins as needed. Gene regulatory networks created new elements, proteins, that are needed for biological functioning. And the physical basis is molecular signaling and the change of shape of macromolecules. Now, the origin of biological information, the development of DNA codings, which is the base sequences in the DNA, takes place through an evolutionary process which results in adaptation of an organism to its ecological niche. This is a classical case of top-down action from the environment to detailed biological microstructure. So what I'm talking about here is the ways, there were two ways in which downward causation takes place. It sets by setting boundary conditions, but it also takes place by creating lower level stuff. And one of the really important things that happened in the past was downward causation resulted in DNA and specific DNA codings. And that's a process of Darwinian natural selection. So what happened is there was top-down action from the environment to detail biological microstructures through Darwinian adaptation based on random mutations. Random mutations took place, the environment fixed the specific DNA coding. There's no way you could ever predict DNA coding on the basis of biochemistry or microphysics alone. You can't even ask the appropriate language in the language of physics. If you ask a physicist per se, please predict for me DNA coding, they won't be able to do it because they can't tell you why that DNA coding is what it is. New information comes into biological processes when DNA is coded by natural selection. And it's unpredictable because a random element occurs, because when DNA is reproduced, errors occur, and then the ones which is most suitable in the environment is selected and the other ones are eliminated. So what processes take place? The environment here, the Arctic, basically tells the animal it's good to have white fur because then you can creep up on your prey without being seen. Basically, that tells the DNA sequence, hey, it's going to be good to have a DNA sequence that produces molecules which will produce white fur, which will then blend into the environment. So through natural selection, top-down action of the environment codes information about appropriate responses to the environment into the detail-based sequence in the animal's DNA. And so the ecological context, the coded DNA is this double helix, which I'm sure you're aware of. It's got these base pairs, CG, which pair with each other, AT, which pair with each other, and the ecological context results in a specific coding, which will result in the production of the white fur, which we saw in the previous slide. And so that's how downward causation causes this particular DNA to come into existence. The DNA in the bear, the white bear, is different from the DNA in a black bear in the Canadian forests. And then the ecological context for species and individuals. You have trophic pyramids. You have soil, you have detrivores, decay, which goes into the soil. You've got all of this stuff in the soil. Plants, herbivores, primary predators, secondary predators. And then you can represent networks of interaction. So you've got trophic pyramids and food webs. And this context provides the niches that specific species can occupy. Upward emergence takes place, downward interactions take place. what secondary predators you have determines what kind of primary predators you have, because these feed on these provide food for these feed on these, as shown in your network of interactions. The primary predators eat the plants provide the food, and so you get these upward and downward interactions taking place all the time. And the downward interactions determine what plants will be there, because the herbivores eat some plants, they leave other plants, and that determines what plants can exist. It creates niches of plants. The biggest system is the system's ecology, interactions between all the factors allowing ecologies to function. Upwards and downward interactions take place. So you've got carbon dioxide, sun is coming down, it's used, and the carbon dioxide is taken up by plants, creates biomass, creates fuels, and then there's a whole big story here, which I'm not going to go into the details of, but there's interaction of carbon dioxide, plants, and the industrial stuff we're doing, the way we extract gas and so on, hydrogen fuel cells, and all of these factors are taken into account by systems ecology. And the even bigger picture is the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the water cycle. You get these huge cycles whereby upward and downward interactions are taking place and providing the context within which we can live. And if we engage in global warming, we are interacting and we are messing up these cycles. And that is where our interactions with the global environment cause serious problems to occur. So I've been trying to give just a general picture. This is all hierarchical stuff. There's hierarchies here from the tree, the macro level, the cycle as a whole, down to the molecules which are taking place, down to the electrons are interacting. The interaction is taking place all the way up those scales and all the way back down, and the whole thing is a very complex integrated whole, and it's all modular hierarchical structures interacting with each other, which is what I've been trying to get across. Now, the crises facing us, global warming, floods, fires, rising seas is one absolutely essential. There's just a new report come out about the danger of global tipping points. The other global crisis is global poverty and starvation. Humanity is in the need of the basics of life, and so what is required is sustainable development. And to understand the problems of sustainable development, you must go back to all of the stuff from Vaclav Smil and how these interact with these big cycles I've just been talking about, and try to get this big picture. And it's this complexity which one has to deal with if you're going to actually make a difference to what is going on in these contexts. So the big issues: providing sufficient food, nutrition, the energy issues I've talked about, and the right amount of water. If you have too little water, the food doesn't work out because you've got a drought and the plants wither away. If you've got too much, then the crops drown and the farmers can't harness their crops. You need the right amount of water, not too much and not too little. One of the things you have to do is fight weeds and pests. And one of the ways to use this is genetically modified crops, which are ways of fighting weeds and pests. And I'll mention that again in just a minute. I'm a supporter of genetically modified crops if they're done in the right kind of way. And you have to provide sufficient energy, and you have to do that without worsening global warming. And I've gone through some of the problems with that as outlined by Vaclav Smil. The trouble is modern society depends on energy in crucial ways, in particular agriculture does, and so it's a very narrow path that you have to tread. You've got to understand these complex interactions whereby the global warming is taking place through the energy going up, getting reflected down by the atmosphere and so on, which I've talked about. And we need to get renewables as much as we can together with nuclear power, but we're never going to be able to get rid of using coal or gas or such things because of the need for agriculture. Well, when we take actions, the thing I want to start closing off with, it's our values that determine what we do. And we can have values of all sorts as individuals, and this will affect how we act as scientists and how we interact with everything that I've just talked about. There's a basic dichotomy for individuals and for all organizations. And the basic dichotomy in terms of values is, are we working for ourselves or are we working for the common good? Are we working to enrich ourselves at the cost of everybody else and enhance our prestige, or are we working to help other people? In many cases, right across the world, the latter is true. In many countries, political parties, political elites are working to enrich themselves at the cost of their fellow beings, at the cost of the environment, at the cost of global warming. And it is very important that the kind of community that this meeting represents, the community of physicists, it must be clear what its values are. And I believe that the physicists who meet and this kind of meeting that we are today are the kind of people who do want to work for the common good and not just to enrich ourselves or enhance our prestige. This is absolutely central to all of the actions that we take place. And then the further point is in taking action, you are now a physicist, you're going to do some environmental stuff, and you're going to try to improve the situation. You're dealing with people, and people interact. And the way people react is to a large degree affected by emotions rather than rationality. And so you may say, oh, goodness me, we're scientists and we're not influenced by emotions, but even scientists are strongly influenced by emotions, and we need to face up to that fact. We want certain things to be the case. We don't want certain other things to be the case, and it's an emotional response often which guides us. Now, this is for good reasons. Emotions, we have emotions because they provide fast guidance to the intellect as to how to behave, and emotions have been built into us by evolutionary processes. The primary emotional systems have evolved and they are embedded into our minds through processes I could discuss, through the structure of the mind and ways I could discuss. We have these emotions because they guide the intellect. And if the intellect is not guided by emotions, it's liable to go off the rails. A purely rational life is not actually going to work out. And that's actually been proved by Antonio Damasio and other people. If the emotions are not guiding rationality, you will tend to move in a way which doesn't work. And Antonio Damasio, there's a very famous case of a guy who had the emotional centers of his brain destroyed, a guy called Phineas Gage, and he then started to behave in a very irrational manner because the emotions weren't actually guiding what he did. What you have is a triangle. You've got values, emotions, and you've got values, emotions, intellect, and it's that triangle that you have to balance. We're dealing with both public and with the public and policymakers. We must take this emotional stuff into account. And you have to work out, are we coming in and acting in an arrogant way? Are we coming and say, we're physicists, we know what's right for you, and you better just believe us and do what we tell you? Or are we acting sympathetically and trying to understand why people have the emotional response they do? Are we in giving advice based on all of the other stuff I've dealt with? Are we going to give advice which takes into account the emotional lives that people have? And the quote is, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And physicists, scientists who are dealing with public policy need to remember this particular thing. And when taking action, we're faced with persuasion and misinformation. And there's a determined misinformation campaigns are being run by many who profit from destroying the environment. This is true in many political campaigns where lobbyists are paying politicians vast sums of money to be able to allow them to not take the environment into account, to destroy pollution into rivers, into seas, and into the atmosphere. And they run determined misinformation campaigns saying global warming isn't taking place. It's just a figment of some scientists' imagination, but it's not real. And we have to work out how to deal with information campaigns from that side, from people who are trying to make a quick buck out of the environment, and they do not care what happens to future generations. But regrettably, misinformation is also taking place on the part of some environmentalists. And we could talk about this, but I've run across environmentalists who've spread misinformation and been very misleading about both genetically modified crops and nuclear energy. And that is just as bad as that, because there are some environmentalists who have prevented the use of genetically modified crops in Africa, for example, that could have saved many lives. They fought against the introduction of golden rice into China, when it would have helped many children had a better life. So we have to counter disinformation campaigns in an effective way, stating the current scientific consensus, but being persuasive as we're doing, not being arrogant, being persuasive. And we need determination and persistence to do this. Physicists have a significant role to play, because in the end, many of these issues are based in physics, and I've talked about how that is the case. However, the way they work out is a result of the complex interactions of physical and social modular hierarchical structures, and social structures too are modular hierarchical structures. Taking all this into account and acting on it as a community is a challenging but rewarding activity, demanding determination, persistence, and understanding. And physicists can play a useful role in this regard, because, as the series says, physics matters. Christine, are you there?
Yeah, exactly. Are you sharing screen, or it's all okay? It's all fine.
Yeah.
That's what nice conclusion. So thank you very much. So I think we had a perfect view of all the different aspects, reviewing from all the different complex aspects that makes life, this wonderful capacity as well, and this complexity that we can potentially as well find ways to control in some sense, and how emotion as well in that aspect have a role as well to play for the interpretation. So we had a lot of action and reaction as well, so that were triggers. So thanks to your presentation with our audience. So thank you very much for participating. So we will have so now the possibility to start the question and answer. And we have, so Andrea has managed to start. He was finding a way to arrive from the plane to the to his office, and I think that he could also, there we go, so be able to participate in our panelists. And you have seen also Louisa, who was with us for a short time, but unfortunately she had to leave. And we had a lot of really positive feedback so far that we see. So should we start? So maybe Andrea, so if you want to give your first feeling also and feedback.
Well, yeah, the fact that all these levels of complexity are relevant to the entire picture, I think that it is also what we have to take into account in developing our institutions with dealing with science. So it's not, it really permeates also how the way we structure the institutions we are working with, which are a part, an essential part of this ecosystem. Yeah, so we have ICTP in Trieste, which is interacting with other international institutions and provide that kind of non-selfish environment, which is, as has been said, essential to the advancement, because we definitely need the help of everybody in order to get out of the several problems we have put ourselves in as a humanity.
Exactly. I think so. Was it? Did you manage to understand the contents as well of the comments and potentially your own opinion with what Andreas has described? So, do you know if, for instance, in South Africa, so there are some perspective where in universities as well, this type of view is already captured in the syllabus?
The one that, sorry, you're asking me?
Mm-hmm. Exact.
Well, it's spread across departments. We have some very good environmental departments in this country, and I have good confidence in them. We have some good water resource departments in this country, which is very good. We have excellent molecular biology, and so. But the whole integrated view I've tried to present, I'm not aware of anybody else who's trying to actually put it together as a kind of integrated view. But we do have an Academy of Science, which is very busy in various contexts. Yeah, so I think that's about as much as I can say on that.
Yeah, indeed. It's also a good possibility for, if we look at the different development in scientific case as well, where large scale could also find as well additional in cases to support. So all those different ecosystem, the connection as well of that. Yeah.
Yeah, we do have very good ecologists in this country. That I can say. Yeah.
Very good.
But what I'm not convinced of is, for instance, that our ecologists are engaged with the kind of physical issues that Vaclav Smil has talked about, which I've talked about. And that Smil book, it's really clear about all of these, the way these different energies are necessary to keep society going. And so if you're going to keep the nitrogen going, to keep the agriculture going, if you that has a cost in terms of and the tractors and as you said, fishing has got a very, very high cost because of the diesel fuel used in fishing. And I'm not aware. There is a sustainability institute outside Stellenbosch, which I'm afraid I'm not very closely linked with. But what I would like to see is that they take up these challenges of, for instance, the fishing. Well, what do we do about the fishing? Do we say we don't want diesel fishing anymore? How are we going to handle this in terms of this bigger picture of reducing our footprint in the sky, if I can use that phrase?
Yeah, exactly. And that's really looking at the different angle as you have been, so having those expertise, so from the astro to the elementary. So I will start, maybe, Andrea, do you want to help me as well with some of the questions?
Okay, sure.
Please.
So let's go into order. So the first question came from Idris Nugeya, and it is, how can a mathematical physicist or a plasma physicist contribute to work in the very problem of global warming? Is global warming the most alarming problem in the modern civilization?
It is a alarming model. If you say if it is the most alarming one, we could start worrying about the use of nuclear weapons. We could start worrying about the use. I was just the other day in a seminar about the use of artificial intelligence with autonomous weapons. Now that is a pretty difficult kind of thing. And you're sending autonomous weapons out guided by artificial intelligence. By autonomous weapons, it means once they're out there, you don't have any more control over them. So, but these are very, very important kinds of issues. But I think it's very important for people in the physics area to try to evaluate global warming and steps that can be taken and the uncertainties. Now, I think what is very important here, and I haven't talked about this, is that there are significant uncertainties in weather forecasting and in predictions of global warming. And the problem is, and I've had the experience of this, of various engineer friends of mine who said they're engineers, they're not experts in climate science and atmospheric science or any of this, but they say, we've taken a look at some of the models and we don't believe the models and we don't believe that global warming is a real thing. Now, sometimes this is lobbyists who've been paid to say this, but sometimes it's a real kind of issue. And I have a friend, Tim Palmer, who spends a lot of time looking at uncertainty and uncertainty in weather forecasting, and what he's developed a method of dealing with uncertainty in weather forecasting, and you need the same kind of thing. In the end, talking truth to the public, we must not hide from them any uncertainties that there may be in our models which predict global warming, because it costs a lot in terms of dealing with global warming when you have a carbon tax, things like that. It's a real cost to the public and to various nations, and we're trying to get a global agreement, and we've just seen in COP23 that there are some countries which do not want to take part in this global agreement. Luckily, we did seem to end up with some kind of agreement, but the point about this, if you want to get involved, you need to take the trouble to really understand the physics issues, the fact that there's a great deal of uncertainty in terms of the cloud interaction with the sea and the sun. This kind of interaction there is really very complicated. It's difficult to predict. And you've got the fact that you've got chaotic dynamical systems taking place. So your short-term weather forecasts are limited because you've got dealing with chaotic dynamical systems. So I think there is a big role to play, but people who want to do it have got to do it seriously. You can't do it part-time as something you do in a couple of spare hours every evening. You actually have to put a lot of time and effort into doing it.
Thank you. This answers quite well. Then another question from the same Idris Nguyen. And what standards are used to organize the table of the hierarchies of causations into levels?
Sorry, what standards are used?
What standards are used to organize the table of the hierarchies of causations into levels?
Oh, how do you organize them into levels? It depends what the system is, but basically, in terms of the way the human body works, they're fairly kind of clear. And the way an ecosystem works, it gets much more complicated. It depends on the nature of the specific ecosystem. But nevertheless, you have trophic levels of different kinds which interact with each other. And the way that you know you've got a level is when you've got specific laws that work at that level. For instance, in physiology, we can understand the way the heart works, the way the lungs work, and so on. We can understand at a lower level the way that molecular biology takes place. We've got very well-established laws at that level. And where it gets a bit dicey is at the psychological level, where we would like to have good, and it gets even more dicey at the sociological level. And of course, people have tried to get laws at that level and at the economic level. And I would say something about that is that in the end, we want to know how these models interact with society. And that is where the real complexity and the real difficulty comes in, because economists have tended not to take seriously the hierarchical structure of society. Economists have tended to say there is just individuals, and some economists just say basically that there is no agency at emergent levels in the economy. Now, in my opinion, that's simply false. There is emergent levels occurring in the economy, but this is a whole other discussion. There is a hierarchical structure in social science in which emergent institutions have agency of their own. And interestingly, a place where this is discussed quite nicely is Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens, where he talks about the agency of social institutions. And it's very important that social institutions do have agency. And so you can address politicians, you can address the mass by social media, but companies, major companies have social agency, and persuading companies that what they do matters is a question of the agency of companies. And some of my colleagues in Oxford are looking at this, trying to say that we can influence the way that companies work at that level, and at a higher level, one can try to influence how capitalism, what are the goals of capitalism, what is it trying to gain? And there is a movement currently trying to get capitalism to act in a responsible way and not to just act without taking any account of the damage which capitalism is causing to the environment locally, like dumping poisonous stuff into rivers, which has been taking place, and more globally by trying to undermine environmental legislation.
Thank you. This was a quite remarkable question, I must say, and a very good answer. Thank you so much. Christine, I want you to continue for the next.
Exactly. Yeah, the role of politics. So I think indeed this multidisciplinarity as well that is involving, so the different level and the standard as well, trying to find ways to work against misinformation. So as you were mentioning as well in your presentation, that's fundamental at every level.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Exactly. So then another.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Your problem is you come up against the way that social media works nowadays, and the way that social media has got an economic structure that it is paid for generating anger. And social information, that the algorithm actually tries to generate anger by the way that it creates echo chambers, and it's based, the social media gets, it generates its revenue by generating clicks. Clicks are generating by making people angry. And that actually is one of the fundamental problems underlying a lot of what's going on.
Exactly. So those kind of standards that we mentioned, I think could be as well a way looking at the ethic as well, how to find a positive capacity as well with this machine learning or all these different artificial intelligence that will be a reality soon. So indeed, the journalism, maybe all the different communication tools would really have to be tuned in that sense. So we have another question. So from Moises Alvarez, so asking or making the reference so that there is a very similar, it's very similar to the emergence materialism and the systematic approach of the scientific philosophy of Mario Bong. So would you know Mario Bong, and can you see any kind of analogy or the difference that you tried as well to portray in your presentation?
I'm not an expert on Mario Bang, but I believe from what I do know that he would broadly agree with what I'm saying. The big picture of what I'm engaged with, I started off as a cosmologist, and I worked on general relativity, black holes, that kind of thing. But I've now spent many years trying to look at the emergence of complexity. And my big battle, if you like, is against reduction, is characterized by the big phrase "nothing but." And whenever I hear the phrase "nothing but," I know that we're being told something which is probably not right. And I think Mario Banga is someone who basically has taken the same side about this. And so I've probably said enough on that.
Yeah, very good. So we have another question from Arpan Den. So, so if it could be discussed, so whether the consciousness is likely to be weakly emerging or stronger emergent. So maybe back to this emotion aspect and the role of the conscientiousness.
Yeah. I personally think it's very clear that strong emergence take place. There's not the slightest hope whatever in predicting from physics that giraffes will exist. Physics defines a possibility space, but because physics does not know anything about the difference between a live system and a dead system, physics cannot even begin to relate to Darwinian evolution, which led to the DNA, which led to the to giraffes and us for that kind of matter. So I'm a strong believer in strong emergence. But your listeners might be interested, if you look on Google Scholar, I've recently done a paper on Aristotelian causation and how the 4 forms of Aristotelian causation can be updated to be applicable very usefully in the modern world. And I think that is a useful perspective to take about emergence.
Very clear. We have a similar maybe question looking at, so by Chris Gould. So when you mentioned the study on the importance of emotion in making decision, so could you remind us what it was?
Yes, the base, we've got primary emotions and secondary emotions, and the primary emotions have been built in us by natural selection because they help us to survive. Now, there is a guy who is now dead called Jaak Panksepp, who has spent a lot of time looking at the primary emotions, and he said there were 7 of them which are inbuilt. And the point is, the moment you're born, you're not born with any knowledge about the world. Some people have imagined we're already born with what they call a naive physics module or whatever. We have nothing of the sort. We've got a capacity to learn, a capacity to predict, and a capacity to remember, to learn and to predict, basically. And anything we do alters our brain. Now, the primary emotional systems are there to give immediate guidance, and they're based in the precortical areas, not in the cortex, and they send neurotransmitters through the brain, which then change the way our connections take place in the brain. And for instance, there's a fight system and a flight system. There's what's called the seeking system, which is the system which leads to understanding. And all the time we are seeking to understand. It's one of the basic drivers. If you watch a very young child, they're always trying to understand what is going on. That's driven by the seeking system. And one of the very interesting ones is the play system. And all animals, higher animals, are wired to play. And play is when you're doing something which doesn't have any immediate come back to you. You're rough and tumble play, and then pretend play. And in our children, play is a crucial way that we learn. And so the play system is one of the primary emotional systems. And I could talk about the other ones, but I'm saying that these, if you think of computer science, you've got the application programs and you've got the operating system. And the operating system decides what's the application program we will run next. And in a certain sense, our emotions are doing that. Our emotions are telling our intellect, look, pay attention to this thing because this thing is important. Our intellect needs guidance as to what's important. And our emotions do that on the one hand, and our values do it on the other hand. And there's this triangle of the intellect, the emotions, and our values. And those are our responsibility as individuals, is to balance between these three things, the intellect, the emotion. And we mustn't be over-emotional, but we must recognize that emotions are there for a really, really good reason.
And indeed, I would quote you as well when you were mentioning that you can forget many things, but you can never forget so how you make people feel. The feeling, this aspect, this is crucial, and it's something that we definitively cut.
If people feel that scientists are being arrogant to them, they're not going to listen to what we say.
But that might not mean arrogant. So this persistence as well that you were speaking about, I think that's and the culture, the cultural aspect. So what you were describing, l'inné et l'acquis, as we would say as well in France. So this is also those aspects. Trained, depending on the culture, it could mean something different. So again, communication. If one day, do you think that one day we could have a Monte Carlo being able to get the global understanding of human emotion? Do you think AI one day will successfully get that in a positive output?
I do think the cultural aspect is very different, and different countries are very, very different in terms of their relation to science. And when I was employed in Italy at CISA, I was struck by how teachers, professors were held in high esteem, whereas to be quite frank, in a country like England, teachers and professors are not held in a very high esteem by many of the people in the country. And there's a great big cultural thing which goes on here. I think in France, professors are held in high esteem.
Indeed, and even I would say within Africa, as we have seen with this African school, where we met actually. So there is also a huge difference between one country and another one. So, and the different as well level in the culture. Yeah. So I will go for an additional question. So that was raised by Arpen Day. So that you were thinking that we need also a fundamental new kind of law to understand the complex phenomena. So or can they, at least in theory, be understood using the same laws governing much simpler system? So can we find a way to model those simple systems that could then represent this complexity and reverse? Or do we need iteration? How would you do that?
I haven't talked about this, but there's a couple of absolutely fundamental laws in complex systems, whether they are living systems or engineering systems, or one of them is feedback. Feedback control is a fundamental principle in all living systems. And you have an error, you have to detect the error, you have a goal, you compare them, and you take action to correct it. Feedback control is absolutely central. Adaptive selection is absolutely central. You get an ensemble, you vary to get an ensemble of stuff, and you see which of them works best, and you delete the ones which don't work, and you keep the ones which do work. And so adaptive selection is absolutely crucial, also as a basic principle. Interestingly, a third principle in complex systems is oscillations. And there are many, many oscillations in living systems, in daily life, in society, and in fact, our brains have got many, many different oscillatory rhythms built into them. Our daily life has rhythms built into them, and society has rhythms. For instance, an interesting thing is the week. The week is kind of universal across societies. You could ask, why on earth is that? And it's, to my mind, that's because there's a 7-day time scale. It's a time scale in the human brain. We get tired and we need a relax at the end of 7 days in order to, indeed of 5 days, in order to prepare for the next week. So there are oscillations which are a natural kind of thing which takes place in all complex systems. A computer is built on oscillations, the primary oscillation in computers. And cell division and so on, the heart is beating in a cycle, the lungs are beating in a cycle.
So all those cycles, I really like the idea indeed of finding ways. And when you look at the PID in the control loop, this predictive one could be as well a way to model, depending on the feedback from the culture, so depending on the environment, and depending on the perturbation as well, to find the best convergence. So there could certainly be some good algorithm to develop. So for future physicists.
And then there's two more general principles. All living systems are open systems, and they convert. They have metabolic systems. You convert matter and energy to the forms that you need to use them, and then you have to get rid of waste matter. If you ask why do you have to get rid of waste matter in the end, it's because of the second law of thermodynamics. And so we are thermodynamic creatures, open systems, and we couldn't live if that wasn't the case. We take in energy, but in information terms, we're also open systems. We get in information and our brain processes it, and we throw away a huge amount of information which is irrelevant. We separate out the information which is relevant, we store it, we process it, and we predict from it.
Yeah, so this is all about the method and the methodology and the discipline, together with the perseverance, certainly, because it's never easy to converge at the first time.
Yes, so one of the key issues in information in society is which is the information which is irrelevant and which is the information which is relevant. And we've got huge amounts of information coming into us. It's got worse and worse with the internet, with social media and all of that. And but this has been a problem. And this is as I say, the emotional systems are there to help us to select which information is the stuff we should pay attention to.
Yeah, a very good advice. So one more question from Idris. So asking as well on how to be persuasive. So using the scientific consensus when talking to non-scientist community. So how to convince a young African generation to contribute into what she would call the physics for environment. How
the younger generation.
African, for instance, young physicists.
Look,
or not physicists.
There are some problems in African culture in terms of what I have encountered in various places. There is still some beliefs which are strictly anti-scientific, but of course this is also the case in a lot of the fundamentalist churches in America. There's a lot of anti-scientific beliefs in those as well. I think what one should try and do is, firstly, I think for many people, diagrams are very helpful. And I think if you have a simple diagram that illustrates cause and causal effects, I think that's useful. I think slogans are useful. Very simple slogans are like the slogan, survival of the fittest is a very good slogan. I happen to think that's a very misleading slogan. And I think a lot of survival is based on cooperation. And so I think one should actually talk about survival of the most cooperative. And there's a huge difference between those two kinds of slogans. And so I think scientific communicators need to think about very simple slogans which convey deep principles, but they have to be the right kind of ones. I think diagrams are very useful to convey information about that. And so I had a slightly complicated diagram about global warming. I think a simple version of that diagram of global warming could be very helpful.
I think those graphics are fundamental, as you said. So the visual and the seven sense, the visual one is certainly one that will bring and print everything in our brain in a more effective way.
The third one that scientific communicators need, we need to remember, and I didn't emphasize this, stories are a way of communicating. And if you want to talk about global warming, one of the things you can do is talk to people who have survived flooding, people who have survived a forest fire which came roaring through and destroyed the whole town in which they lived, and so on. I think that it's important in terms of global warming to put together some stories about what has happened and some stories about what could happen, about the fact that huge areas of Bangladesh may go underwater. Even quite large areas of New York could go underwater. So you have a bit of a science fiction story talking about the future. The fiction is because in the future, the science is, it's talking about the real probable effects of global warming. So I do want to recommend stories as being a way of communicating science to the general public.
And especially, I would say, in Africa, and even looking at the younger generation. So I think it's the perfect ways as well to be like bringing creativity in the mind as well of the young kids so that they can be interested to go into physics. So
Absolutely. I think there's, my wife actually works in children's literacy. I think having books which are good for young children to get them enthused about, and I think there are scientific principles. Now, I think one can get a bit silly about this. There have been some books about teaching quantum physics to children, and so I don't think that's going to work. But I think that you can teach very young kids about energy conservation, momentum conservation, matter conservation, stuff like that. And so I think that children's books which convey basic scientific principles could be great. Quite how far you can go. For instance, I'm not sure if one can convey the idea of electromagnetic radiation. That there's one kind of radiation which is both X-rays, they won't know what X-rays are, through to light, infrared, and so on. But they will know about remotes that work by infrared. They will know about infrared microwaves and so on. And so it has to be done carefully with caution. I think energy conservation, without any doubt, you could. The fact that useful energies turn to unusable, I'm sure one can convey that one about. I'm sure one can convey the idea of wasting energy. And for instance, there are some practical devices. So for instance, you can construct, and in fact, you can construct simple solar heaters for a pot. You just get a parabolic mirror, you put a pot at the focus, you can teach kids that they can heat up like that. And then we have a thing which is called the Wonder Box. Now, the Wonder Box is a container made of soft material, and it's got a lid, a soft lid, and you heat up a pot and you make it very hot, and then you put it in this thing, you put the top on, and it keeps the heat in, and it will cook stuff for hours on end, and you put half-cooked stuff in, and you get cooked stuff out. And so I think you can teach scientific principles, not just through books, through stories, but I think you can actually make some projects in which people carry out scientific stuff which actually works and is useful, like a parabolic reflector for cooking stuff, and then this heater, which we used to call the Wonder Box. It's got other names. So it's a soft container with lots of fabric. It's very good insulator and a top, and you put your rice in, and it's cooked when you come back home.
That's a perfect example. And I know that unfortunately, so Bernard Hamadeh, who is the founding father of Engineers Without Borders, would have really appreciate hearing this as well, because that's part of those type of example as well that he tried to recreate, whether in South America or in Africa. So, and it gives us a lot of perspective in terms of what we could develop for cases as well within the APS with our outreach and communication committee. So thanks a lot for bringing all those ideas. And those little movie, I think that's one of the aspects as well, which is important, how to disseminate the information. So we can certainly think in terms of storytelling, as you said, like the Big Bang Theory, for instance. Those type of activities are certainly also good. We could show example of what you were describing here to apply it to the youngest mind as well, so that they can also think how to get involved and how to experience as well physics by themselves. So then we have maybe to read faster so the question, because there's so many. You see, you drove a lot of attention to our audience. And again, there are people from everywhere in the world that are connecting. You could see from the chat that a lot of people were calling from different area. And we have, so another question from Wida Basson. So who is, so thanking you again for this very interesting talk and thought and provoking presentation, as she mentioned. So she's asking a question, which I think is quite interesting, is that is there a point so where a complex system becomes so complex that it breaks down and or start malfunctioning as a cancer, if we would think? And that would be, could it be called the chaos, and what would emerge after the chaos?
Yeah, complex systems, there are principles for stability of complex systems. As I said, feedback control is one of the great principles. Cancer is a case. My colleague Paul Davies has tried to understand cancer from a physics viewpoint. He's run a project on that. If a system, it has to be structured, and I'm not an expert in network dynamics, but I think some kinds of networks are more stable than others. And this is important, for instance, in electric power systems, things like that. So this is an area that I'm certainly not an expert in. But the very general principle is if you can construct your system so that it's adaptive, so that it tries things and then keeps the ones which work and rejects the ones which don't, if you can construct your system in such a way, then that will be the way that it will become fairly stable. However, I must give a warning, is that any system built like that will only be able, it will only have been, it's like the AI systems, it's trained on what's happened in the past. And there are so-called black swan events, which are basically unpredictable. And for instance, we know there's going to be another global pandemic. And Bill Gates has been actually a wonderful actor in this case. He has been way ahead of the game. He's been trying to protect us in advance of this happening. We know there's going to be another global pandemic. We've had them in the past. We've had terrible global pandemics like the global flu pandemic 1922, which was far worse than what we've had recently. We know there's going to be global pandemic, which we don't know when it will be, or we don't know the details. But what we can do is set up laboratories and so on, which are ready to analyze. We can set up precautionary systems, which will try to be ready for the unpredictable. Now, that sounds paradoxical, but that's what we've got to try to do.
Yeah, the paradox is also something which is important, to try to be closer to the reality, if there is one reality as well. Well, the perfect one. So one more question as well, and something very relevant as well from Kisley Leviette, who is trying to summarize as well your presentation. So he would say, or she would say, so sorry, that this is the sum from two terms, energy and time, and that invariably compels her or him, sorry, I don't know which gender it is to ask how possibly is it to measure it very precisely, this energy and this time, knowing that the uncertainty principle disproves the exactness of events. A really good point.
So, sorry, can you come back again?
So energy and time that are invariably compelling for him, this is the fact that you cannot precisely measure time and
correct. Yeah. But in terms of prediction, it's possibly more important. You can't measure position and momentum more accurately there, and so therefore Laplace's demon is not possible even in principle, because you can't measure the position and the momentum simultaneously accurately, which is what you need for Laplace's deem it to work. And then given the fact that they are chaotic dynamical systems, the dream of being able to predict accurately from initial data is simply not realizable. Although in practice, in biology, the real unpredictability is at the molecular level. Each molecule in our body is undergoing millions of collisions per second, and it's absolutely impossible to predict. So the wonderful thing about this, and my friend Dennis Noble has written about this, nature knows, if you like, about this unpredictability and has learned to extract order from this chaotic dynamics which is taking place within each cell in our body. And molecular machines, kinesin and dynein, they use this chaotic energy to extract order. And that's one of the wonderful things that happens in biology.
And this is deterministic, so this is also why it's easier. Yeah.
Yes, there are layers of indeterminacy and determinacy. And at the level of molecular biology, there's a huge amount of chaotic stuff going on at the level of reading of the molecular stuff, but the genetic system works very accurately. And the extraordinary thing is that reading the genes, there's something like one error in every 7 million base pairs. Now, that doesn't sound much, but actually that is a deadly rate of error. But then there are systems in the cell which compare what ought to have happened with what does, and they correct them. And those error correcting mechanisms reduce the error to 1 part in several billion. And that is why we survive, why we don't just fall apart, because our genes are read so inaccurately.
So the next
probably
potential.
have to go now. I think we've gone a bit over time.
And we had several hands that were raised during the presentation. So sorry again, so if we couldn't take your question. So I would like, so thank you. So this is him. So sorry again for my ignorance with names. We would like to have maybe George Onel, also from South Africa. If you want to speak up and potentially raise those lessons learned as well from you, because there was a lot of really interesting aspects. So maybe you could speak up and have a chat shortly, because we have not too much time. George?
Yeah, I'll try to summarize. You can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So yeah, I'm actually British, but I was working at UWC for a couple of years. I think one thing that I think is really hard to tackle going from this bottom-up approach is that there's these external pressures that make it, for example, the costs associated with nuclear power. It should make it unattractive for countries with high amounts of sun, like Chile or even Norway, that has a lot of money. It has a lot of water and mountains, so it has other pressures. And I think you touched as well on Cape Town is a good example when you talked about sustainability. It's quite hard to do because of the economic costs associated with it. So fishing, for example, is possible from the beach in Muizenberg using these massive trek nets, but that has large costs. It's not sustainable for other reasons. And I can see the massive benefits that the work that the science has, and especially physics and fundamental physics with ITEMBA labs, which maybe a lot of other people don't know, but there's this large science accelerator just outside of the city of Cape Town. But my impression was from my time there, the externalities mean that it's quite hard to solve all the problems. And I think the question really is, how do we pick the most important priority from the kind of emotion, the science approach that you talked about, given that we do exist in a world where we have a finite amount of time and particularly a finite amount of money?
Yeah.
So
Well,
how to set priority?
You're talking about multi-criteria decision making. And this is a complex topic. In fact, my old colleague from UCT, who was an expert in that area, has just died. I've just been going to a lot of funerals recently. I want to say that in terms of the nuclear thing, the costs of the big power stations are prohibitive, but that isn't the only way to go. It is possible to do modular nuclear reactors, pebble bed modular reactors. And actually, South Africa had a very advanced modular pebble bed reactor project going, which unfortunately got put aside. It was really, in my view, a very excellent program because you don't have to have huge nuclear reactors. You can make much smaller ones. And the Western Cape, we would have been in dead trouble if we didn't have the Koeberg nuclear power station, because the power in this country is total chaos because of corruption and inefficiency, which I could go into. But I think in the end, the point about it is at a very broad range, the question is, are you trying to do this for the public good or for your own good? And in this country, Eskom has broken down because a lot of corrupt politicians who are trying to grab as much money as they could for themselves. But you need to break it down into where in the country should you focus one's energy. And of course, part of the thing is public and private, and there's a huge amount of energy and capacity and intelligence in the private sector. And so you really need to do this old thing. What should the public do? What should the private do? And at a considerable level, one needs to have a political system where private enterprise is encouraged to go ahead, but is not allowed to be rapacious. And that's this kind of issue that needs to be done, and one can do that. And then you can ask, where should the public energy go? And the kind of thing which is really important is, for instance, making internet available at zero cost to all the really poor communities, because one of the quickest way for really poor people to raise themselves up is by giving them access to the internet, where they can access all of this kind of stuff. You need very low cost computers being made available at public libraries or wherever, and free digital access, unlimited digital access to people in the poorest communities is the kind of thing which can make a really big difference.
And there also to adapt depending on the country. And I want to call, maybe there are those initiatives from Smart Africa that could be potentially some kind of way forward. And when you say, indeed, the internet and the possibility as well for access to internet, or we have developed a lot of MOOC, for instance, massive open line course. So all those would be a way forward. Still, we feel and we see that bandwidth is quite limited, depending also where those countries are located. So it's really having to do with the politics as well, to try to make sure that there is this full capacity as well for the massive distribution of the information.
Correct. And in this country, it's quite clear that the ruling party is not interested in upraising the masses, whatever their propaganda may be. That's true also for other political parties I could mention, but won't. And one needs public pressure to change this. Now that we're entering the area of politics, I'll just make one comment. The biggest problem is that the unemployed do not have a political party which represents them. The unemployed who have very little income, very little money, they don't have a political party which actually represents them. And that's just a political statement. Comment.
Exactly. Politics is a different aspect. We look at the level also of a continent, speaking about Africa, which is much bigger than, I mean, Europe, or Africa, or America. So, yeah. So I just want also to comment from one of our audience who is, you are still here. So Waleska, so you had some really interesting comment as well. So you are coming from Guatemala, and as you mentioned, you were already having in the chat some connection while speaking about the energy, the fact that in Guatemala, of course, nuclear reactor might not be easy to think in the soon future, but like all the different aspects with hydro, the production of energy from the hydraulic energy or from and for the agriculture. So what he was asking was the the question about what would be the best compromise. So in your view, so to solve the problem of agriculture system that rely on fossil fuel, so in the near future, if you think about this context, Guatemala.
Yeah, look, I really don't know much about Guatemala. But I return to the fact nuclear power stations do not have to be large. For instance, a nuclear submarine has a nuclear power. They're not large. It's not necessary that it be large. If you have a power source, you can try, for instance, your problem is batteries. If you had really, really good batteries, then you could have battery-powered tractors, and then you would solve a lot of this agricultural thing which Smil talks about. So from the physics viewpoint, there's a challenge to the physicists, and there is quite a lot of work going on in this. Come up with a battery, which is a really, really good source. If it isn't a battery, there are flywheels as one form of possible storage of energy. And I've looked at that a little bit at one point. In Cape Town, we have a really, really good and amazing system. We have hydropower storage. We've got very little water in South Africa. But in Cape Town, there's a pumped storage system whereby during the day, we have one of the things is cycles. I mentioned cycles, and part of the problem in each country, there's a massive demand in the morning and in the evening when everybody gets home, they want to cook and so on. And then there's demand, industrial demand, but there's a cycle of power. And in the times when energy usage is down, what you can do and what happens in Cape Town, water is pumped from a low dam to a high dam. And then at a high demand stage, it goes from the high dam back down to the low dam. That's the kind of thing that take place. Now, in terms of intelligent use of computer systems and power, one of the things which you can do is you can have a system whereby the cost of electricity is metered and it varies on an hour-by-hour basis. And when the global cost is high, people are told on a meter there that we're going to raise the power of electricity because now is our peak period and it's going to cost you more if you use electricity. Now, if you use electricity at midnight when very few people use electricity will be much cheaper. And this is the kind of thing which can easily be done and will help to persuade people to use electricity at the times of the day when it's you're averaging out the fluctuations, and that actually is equivalent. I once wrote a paper about this. One of the things is time zones. Time zones enable you in this country should have 2 time zones. And then you shift the peak in the Transvaal up in Johannesburg to be different to the peak in Cape Town. And then you can ship electricity backwards and forwards in such a way it's actually equivalent to increasing the electricity supply by about at least 12%, if not more than that. And so there are intelligent solutions that can be done in terms of saving electricity.
And indeed, so you describe also the case with South Africa with the load shedding and the possibility as well to find solutions. So I think it's really good to see the adaptation also depending on the different country and depending on the different resource. And also finalizing with so this really big importance that light source and that neutron source are playing with development of those new batteries, with the possibility to store also this energy so that we can transport and we can get so at any time also energy.
But for instance, I don't see a battery with solar panels on, a tractor with solar panels on the top. I don't think that's going to be a viable concept.
Yeah, depending on the country. Very good. I would like maybe to finish because indeed, so there was so many interesting questions. So sorry, we were far beyond also our normal time, but I think everything is recorded and the magic as well of internet gives possibility to watch this so in YouTube, so that will be recorded and distributed to all the different persons who are attending today and beyond. Again, we are trying to stay open source, and we really try to have possibility to communicate and disseminate as much information as possible. And this case of basic science and this sustainable development, I think this is really the key for our year that we are just finishing. And tomorrow, as I mentioned, at CERN, so will be the possibility to close that special year. But because of the success, I can already tell you that there will be a decade of then basic science and sustainable development. So I think it has been wonderful. So thanks to UNESCO and the United Nations, and really with all your work, the hard work, Andrea. So I think the Sesame has played a big role as well. So for your region in the Middle East, but inspiring also a lot of the other part of the world in that quest. So Andrea, I will maybe I would like, if you don't mind, to mention two things. So first, what we'll be presenting as well, and you will see here. So this is a QR that I was shared by John Baker, who is on the behalf as well of the CISA, so the American Physical Society, but with the possibility to align as well with all the different international scientific collaboration, the principles, so that we have been looking at, and really this importance of aligning. So it's the important part of the integrity, the transparency, and the reciprocity of those international scientific collaboration. And as well, so the IUPAC is also pushing for that. We have a lot of open source, like the EOS, for instance, who is also pushing for that. Open source could really be the future, hopefully, for a better world. And I will also finalize this presentation with the call for a next presentation, which will take place in January next year. So we will start by neutrons, so beyond photons. So we have also possibility with neutron, like at the ESS. So to listen here, to Giovanna Francesco, who is the scientific director of the ESS, and she will describe what neutron scattering can do as well, looking especially at the mechanics of cell membrane. So just be aware that the time might be shifted a little bit because it will be right in the middle of our APS, leadership meeting. So we may change whether the time, whether the day, be aware. But we would like really to keep on, having you in our audience as well in 2024, and there will be much more exciting presentation. So thank you very, very much. George, so that was enlightening, as you have seen, for all those questions. So I think that you have kept a lot of brain thinking in terms of how to improve this capacity. And Andrea, maybe I let you finish with one word and saying, for the role as well, again, that Sesame plays in all of that. Maybe looking at how the training or what you are doing as well with the Sesame. I think speaking about sharing information, you do a lot there too.
Yes, it is not the moment to really push so much, to expect too much from a little institution like Sesame is in the present moment of the Middle East. But still, we are definitely trying to keep a light lit, and hopefully that the peace will return as soon as possible, and we will be able to continue in our mission. It is definitely a complicated moment, and it's not. It is not us that will change this fact. It's useless to think that we can do much more than what we will be surely one of the things we are going to focus mostly on 2024. So training for the region, training for Africa. There are projects which we are trying to follow up in order to be more effective in that direction. But as I said before, this is something that we really need. The world really needs to increase the number of persons in science, and to have a bigger impact on the very difficult problems we are crossing.
Thanks a lot for this good word coming from
Yeah.
an area where now in the Middle East, indeed, we really need this kind of application to improve it. So thank you everyone for listening, and we'll have a possibility to stay tuned. So we have, I just put here again, so our webpage on the chat, and we can see what will bring 2024, but we'll try to all work for the best. So thank you very much, and let's stay tuned and happy and positive. Bye. And thank you.
Yes,
George.
sure, Christina. Thank you. And thank you very much for this series, because it's really fantastic, in my opinion. It's one of the most important things that I have participated in this year. Thank you very much.
We need to give hope, that's the thing. So, and perseverance. So that's also one of the things from Adayona. That's what I still remember from her. So perseverance is important. From everywhere in the world. Thank you so much, George. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.